This is the story of a relationship that shaped the course of the Second World War.
U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill.
But what's the truth behind the image the partners presented to the public?
Find out in this series of Churchill, The Finest Half Hour.
Welcome to a brand new series of Churchill, The Finest Half Hour, in which we'll be discussing the relationship between Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt. I'm Professor Richard Toye, and with me is my friend and colleague, Dr. Warren Dockter. How are you doing, Warren?
I'm doing great, Richard, although I do like to think of myself more as your compatriot. And I'm very excited about this episode, and I'll tell you why. We'll be looking at something that's at the heart of the special relationship, which I think in these days is maybe more important than ever.
But I guess, great starting point would be Churchill's tribute to Roosevelt when he died in April 1945. And this was when he was speaking in the Commons on 17th of April. Churchill said that in Roosevelt there died the greatest American friend that we have ever known and the greatest champion of freedom who has ever brought help and comfort from the new world to the old. Very warm words, but, again, people have been skeptical about how, whether this rhetoric really reflected the reality of their relationship.
Well, and also I've always felt like Churchill's words about FDR here, if you read the whole thing especially, is pretty formal. I mean, if he's talking about someone who's a genuine friend, for instance, if I was to eulogize you.
Yeah, anytime.
Son of a, no, but it would be warm. There would be affection. There'd be laughing, obviously. Churchill's feels more like something from a leader of a state describing another leader of state, right? And I think that comes across in his words, and that's odd considering how his own memoirs frame their relationship.
Yes, and I think it's kind of worth turning back to the earlier years, what might have kind of contributed to this arguably slightly lukewarm feeling that was coming through in his tribute to Roosevelt. Sort of going to the sort of interwar period, people may not be aware of how modern this idea of the special relationship is, and there was this intense period of rivalry during the interwar years with naval competition between America and Britain, and even with US war planners preparing what they called War Plan Red to simulate a potential conflict with the British Empire. Now, it is true that, of course, that war planners plan wars. That's what they do. So we shouldn't necessarily mean that there was about to be American destroyers off the coast of Kent or something. But all the same, it is true that the elites of both countries really regarded each other with suspicion.
Well, I should also, there's a political feeling in the United States after the First World War of intense isolationism, in part because of the losses of the First World War, in part because there were several quarters at home that felt that Woodrow Wilson's plan unfairly put the United States into European interests. And then there's also all the naval competition that's taking place, particularly in the Pacific, and then in the various treaties leading up to the Second World War. So I think there very much is a sort of a frosty relationship in the interwar period between the Americans and the British.
Yes, and I think that, of course, Roosevelt was somebody who was much more internationalist, but had to kind of play things very carefully. I mean, let's talk a bit about him. I mean, I think he was somebody who was skeptical of the British Empire, but equally, he was kind of sort of very sort of patrician and he was somebody who kind of had certain things in common with Churchill, but they weren't necessarily going to be immediately on a very good wavelength with each other.
No, and I completely agree. They're very similar in their backgrounds. He was born basically to a landed kind of New York City family.
Okay.
And he was also educated at Groton and Harvard, which I think is really interesting because, of course, we know Churchill was educated at Harrow, but Churchill then went into the military. They
Yeah.
also had similarities in that they both were Navy people.
Right, right. So that FDR became Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the Woodrow Wilson period, the president, Democratic president who you mentioned earlier, and he kind of had this lifelong passion for sea stories. So there was that link because, of course, actually overlapping with that period, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, that is the minister responsible for the Navy from 1911 to 1915. Now, coming back to Roosevelt, it's kind of worth maybe just sort of before talking about that, slipping back to his actual first meeting with Churchill, which had taken place back in 1918.
I think that it's crazy to me that they met, albeit I think relatively briefly, but they met at Gray's Inn in 1918 because, of course, as we said, FDR was the Assistant Secretary to the Navy at that time, and of course, in 1918, Churchill was Minister of Munitions. Isn't that right?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and so they met at a sort of a conference at Gray's Inn, and it was a very like Churchill and all Edwardians used to do in London. And if you read sort of Churchill's impressions, or excuse me, FDR's impressions of Churchill, he did not particularly care for Churchill. And he was actually having a conversation later on with the ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, who we know was no fan of Winston Churchill's, to line up because he said upon recalling that they had met, he described Churchill as having acted like a stinker and that he was lording all over everyone, that he was lording it all over us, which I think is just remarkable when we think of them, the way we imagine them today as best friends and laughing and carrying on. But the first impression that they made on each other was not very good.
Yeah. And so, I guess you've got to remember that Churchill, as you say, he was Minister of Munitions. He met loads of people all the time. He wasn't necessarily going to think, oh, Assistant Secretary to the Navy is somebody I've got to take great notice of. And so he kind of admits later on Roosevelt had frankly slipped his memory until they met again decades later. So that sort of slightly awkward thing early on in their kind of very substantive relationship that Churchill doesn't have any sort of big or significant recollection at all of this initial meeting, which clearly did make some kind of impression on Roosevelt. He's kind of got this promising political career, but then in 1921, it's a kind of personal disaster. Really, he contracts polio, which he to some extent recovers from. I mean, through very arduous kind of physical training and therapy and so on, but he's substantially reliant on a wheelchair. He does get to the point where he can stand and even walk a little if he's got leg braces on, very heavy leg braces, very uncomfortable, which is really a kind of I don't know, yeah, he's very sensitive about his public image, let's put it like that. And
Well, and
that it
for years, as you know, they kept this from the U.S. press. I mean, it was kind of a secret that he suffered from polio. This disability in this.
yeah. I mean, a bit of an open secret, I would say, because the press did know, but they kind of, I mean, it was obviously unavoidable to, it was impossible to conceal entirely. But there are stories of when Roosevelt was president of sort of Secret Service men sort of breaking people's cameras if they'd taken photos in what they regarded as an inopportune way. But so he wanted to have this image of strength, very understandably, really, in a world in which there was I mean, there may still be a lot of prejudice against people with disabilities, but even more so in the 1920s and 1930s. But, he fights back. He becomes a governor of New York. And then, of course, in the depths of depression, succeeds in becoming president, defeating Herbert Hoover in 1932.
Yeah, so if we flash forward from that moment, Roosevelt's in power as president, has been for some time. Churchill, when they first started direct contact, was actually prior to him being prime minister, which I think is important.
Absolutely. I mean, this is kind of an extraordinary thing which happens given that apparently Roosevelt didn't have this particularly warm feeling about Churchill, that on 7th of September 1939, which just days after Churchill has been reappointed as First Lord of the Admiralty at the outbreak of war, Roosevelt actually kicked off a secret correspondence with him, and he sort of bypassing traditional channels in order to sort of keep his hand in, as it were, with somebody who he had already identified was a likely successor to Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain.
Unsurprisingly, Churchill jumped at the opportunity, I think. I mean, he took up the task. One of the things I really love in this sort of coded message, which gets into how much Winston Churchill loved this kind of espionage, and this sort of secret messaging stuff, is he would sign his messages over to FDR as a naval person, or then, because he was First Lord of the Admiralty, and then later on as formal naval person when he became Prime Minister, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, and I mean, as you say, Churchill was kind of enthusiastic about this. I mean, imagine that, you start getting messages from the President of the United States. I think Churchill had a good impression of his own importance, but this must have reinforced that. His sort of enthusiasm for this relationship is reflected in the fact that he does dedicate real care to the messages which he sends to Roosevelt. Now, it's worth saying that sort of throughout the war, particularly when he's prime minister, he's not just sitting down and writing to him like a pen pal. He has got advisors who are helping him do that and making sure that it is all couched diplomatically and so on. But, there correspondence between them fills 3 big published volumes, and it should be said that Churchill is the one who wrote most of those messages. There were times when he was kind of firing stuff off, which wasn't really getting a response from Roosevelt, but he clearly saw this correspondence as a great opportunity.
Well, yeah, and I think he also saw an opportunity, Richard, and you tell me if you agree, you're the expert here, but he saw an opportunity to communicate with Roosevelt, and not just Roosevelt, but perhaps America at large, in his speeches as he started using his oratory after he became prime minister. I mean, you can see that he's always conscious to keep an American audience in his mind.
Completely. And I mean, what we haven't said yet, of course, is that he was half American, that
That's true.
he had traveled to America. He didn't think that Americans really drank enough alcohol and was a bit suspicious of that. He really didn't like prohibition. And sometimes, the fact that his mother was American caused some of the people who disliked him to make sneering comments about him as sort of half-breed American adventurer, is one conservative MP's comment on him. So I think it would be too simple to say Churchill was half American, therefore he loved America. He did show skepticism towards it often, but at the same time, perhaps in some senses, he had a good ear for what an American audience might want.
Yeah, and I think that there are numerous examples of that. I mean, in May 1940, when he is giving speeches in Parliament, he always wants Britain to appear totally inflexible, to have an inflexible resolve, so that Americans will see that he's serious and that there's something to be taken seriously and they wouldn't be a lost cause.
Exactly. And indeed, he's not just making speeches, he is getting messages from various directions, including via Canadian Prime Minister William Mackenzie King, sort of showing the kinds of messages which Churchill believes the Americans want to hear. So he is making clear, I mean, this is good news for America, because if Britain stands firm, then that renders the USA safer. And so, again, he is also kind of doesn't want the Americans to think that they're totally safe or completely uninvolved, because on his famous Fight on the Beaches speech, 4th of June, 1940, Churchill comes up with this image of the new world with all its power and might stepping forward to rescue the old world. And so America is kind of a beacon of hope, but he is also saying, look, guys, you kind of need to be involved here.
Well, and I wanna focus in on that concept. So, in the finest hour speech, one of my favorite things that he does with the language there, I think is really interesting. So he addresses, he warned that if Britain fell, the whole world, including the United States, so he calls them out by name, would sink into a new dark age. I think it's really interesting because he's almost using he romanticizes this, that we're fighting a kind of darkness. And of course, as we would come to find out, the Nazis were as dark as it gets.
Yeah, and I mean, also, of course, it's important to Churchill to show to the Americans, not just in terms of words, but in terms of action, that Britain is going to stand firm. And so the attack on the French fleet after the French armistice with the Germans, Churchill wants, of course, to keep the French fleet out of the German hands. And this attack takes place on 3rd of July, 1940. Is kind of intended to serve as a sort of a forceful event to prove to Roosevelt and the Americans that the British would stop at nothing to survive.
That's a great point, Richard. And after the break, we'll talk a little bit more about tangible examples out of the relationship between Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and with me, as ever, is Professor Richard Toye. And we were just discussing the relationship between Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Winston Churchill, and we had just gotten to a really interesting point where Churchill had been using his speeches to sort of make the American audience take notice of what was going on, and using the symbolic act and literal act of sinking the French fleet at Mers el Kabir.
The first thing to say is we've got to understand why Roosevelt couldn't just act and say, oh, I'll come along and support you and take America into the war. Remembering, of course, that the power to declare war rests with Congress, not with the president. And also, Roosevelt had been elected in 1932. In 1940, he was coming towards the end of his second term, and nobody quite knew what was going to happen next because no previous president had ever served a third term. There was nothing in the Constitution at that stage to bar it. That was a post-World War II development. And so there are other candidates who were, sort of limbering up to be potential Democratic contender in 1940, like Secretary of State Cordell Hull, for example. Now, as we know, in fact, having kind of played a bit cute for a while, Roosevelt finally goes for his third term, but he is due for re-election then in November 1940. And that makes it pretty difficult for him to do anything which looks as though it might be involving American boys in foreign wars. And there's a great suspicion in United States opinion towards Britain and the empire, considerable dislike for Nazi Germany as well, but a very, a sense amongst many people, well, we just don't want to get involved.
Yeah, and as I was saying earlier, the kind of, really this sort of isolationist view that was so strong after the First World War has continued and become amplified as things started to happen again in Europe. Because you also have to remember, from the American perspective, obviously Great Britain and the British Isles makes up a huge part of the immigrant population that moved here to found the country. But the second in line at that time was the German population, and places like Pennsylvania were settled by Germans. And so it's the same sort of idea, and nobody wants a repeat of the First World War because it was so horrific. So these are all weighing down the Roosevelt administration and his ability to help in a literal boots on the ground kind of way.
And just to sort of emphasize, there was this perception in the Midwest, say, in the United States, that the British were very wily, clever people who were going to inveigle Americans into another war. And sort of the idea that, Americans are honest and simple and the British are very clever and devious. Roosevelt was pretty clever and devious, actually. But in terms of thinking about American opinion towards Churchill, some of it's quite admiring, even in isolationist opinions. They kind of say, well, he's a great speech maker. He's a great guy for Britain, but that doesn't mean he's somebody we should necessarily be putting too much faith in. He's with the perception, of course, that the British Empire is very powerful. And so what Roosevelt can do, he's got a little bit of wiggle room, is that he can do things to help Britain if it seems like he's getting a good trade, if he's doing a good deal. And there is therefore this famous destroyers for bases deal, which is negotiated in the summer of 1940 and finally agreed in September, which involves the Americans exchanging 50 really pretty old and decrepit destroyers for 99-year leases on British bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland.
What I find really interesting when this happens, this is obviously a huge win for Churchill, and it's a huge win for Britain at large in the war anyway. Even though the destroyers themselves were not necessarily in peak performance, it still added to the fleet. And what I find really interesting about it is how Churchill presented it in the Commons, because he sort of takes it that one step further, which is probably a place that the American press would have been upset if they heard. But Churchill said, undoubtedly, this process means that these two great organizations will have to be somewhat mixed up together in their affairs. Like the Mississippi, it just keeps rolling along. Let it roll, let it on full flood to broader lands and better days.
And it's worth just mentioning in passing that that's the same speech in which he says of the Battle of Britain, never have so many owed so much to so few. So he could just sometimes do a speech which like knocked out a couple of incredibly famous quotations in one speech.
I tell you what, I miss those days when our politicians could do that.
Well, yeah. I mean, Roosevelt was kind of a difficult person to read, to know exactly what his intentions were. And he was actually quite good at sort of gradually massaging American opinion, not towards a full declaration of war, but to being more helpful. But this Lend-Lease deal, so-called Lend-Lease deal, whereby the Americans provide large amounts of kit and supplies to the British on the grounds that they'll be in some way sort of compensated after the war, not necessarily through financial payment, but through agreement to undertake various commitments with the future of international trade, for example. You know, Roosevelt's sort of good with these homely analogies. He kind of says, well, if my neighbor's house is on fire, I kind of, lend him my fire hose. I don't sort of bother to say you're going to kind of cough up loads of money for this. So he manages eventually by March 1941 to get this very, very substantial and very important financial and supply commitment to Britain, which is, as he says, is going to eliminate the dollar mark so that the British aren't going to be paying for this stuff directly. He does it even though the Americans aren't at war. And Churchill later calls this the most unsordid act in the history of any nation.
I also love the use of the word unsorted there. You don't hear that word often.
Not too often.
But I mean, you can see that that's an increased merger of the two interests of the country, which is basically as Churchill predicted.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
one of my favorite lines, and this was in, I think, Churchill's memoirs, where he even said, that no lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt, because he is courting President Roosevelt in America because he and Great Britain desperately need the English-speaking peoples on this side of the Atlantic to get involved on behalf of the old world, as he said. And I just think that that's a remarkable sentence.
I guess what that quote about studying the whims as though he were a mistress is very revealing of, or gets to the heart of this question of whether or not they were good friends, right? Because it's very sort of instrumental. It didn't necessarily come naturally to Churchill. He had to try and read between the lines of what Roosevelt was doing and what Churchill was saying. And so that was a kind of an analytical relationship, not not necessarily a friendship relationship.
Right. I mean, you could see that that Churchill wants something from FDR, and he's working every angle and every way to make that happen. And so I guess
Yeah.
there's a point at which our two heroes have to meet, and they meet indeed at the Atlantic Conference in 1941.
Yeah, in August off the coast of Newfoundland, which of course is a British territory. And of course, this all has to be done in great secrecy because it's very risky for Churchill to travel, to actually cross the ocean on board the Prince of Wales, could have been done down by a U-boat. And so the fact that he's done it can only be revealed afterwards.
Right, and it takes a lot of sort of choreography to make this thing work. They meet on a Sunday, is that right?
Well, they have this famous onboard service on board ship, on the deck of the ship, and Churchill personally selects some of the hymns like Onward Christian Soldiers. Maybe this is a sort of slightly sentimental observation on Roosevelt's part, but he suggests that the sight of British and American sailors singing together was something that cemented the relationship.
The other thing that we need to get in, I mean, are some of the things that came out of this. And one of them is the kind of way the media was used to make this appear to the American audience versus the British audience, right? That it's
Right.
basically just two Democratic guys getting together, nothing funny. This is just two guys having a normal conversation in the middle of the ocean at a secret location singing hymns. Yeah, yeah.
I think the key point from the British perspective is that they're desperately hoping that Roosevelt has agreed to this meeting because he is kind of ready to come forward with a declaration of war. And of course, that doesn't happen. They get this statement, the Atlantic Charter, but it's not a declaration of war. And so when it's actually Churchill's deputy, Labour leader Clement Attlee, who kind of does a broadcast to sort of announce the decisions, and people are kind of in Britain are disappointed. It's like, well, there was sort of a big fuss about the fact this broadcast was going to take place, but then the actual results, it's like, okay, there's a joint declaration. What's all the fuss about?
So you mentioned one of the things to come out of it, right, is the Atlantic Charter. And, the kind of view in America is to keep it, well, it's not that big, it's just two guys meeting. This Atlantic Charter is a remarkable document, given that context, in my opinion. And one of the things I think that's really interesting about it is it lays down what would be foundational principles for the UN. So much of the post-war world, as we've come to know it up until recently, can find its origins in this document. Now, this is quite serious stuff here, to the point where Churchill was even nervous about the self-determination clause because that kind of fundamentally, at least at sort of philosophical level, undermines the idea of an empire and having colonial subjects in the first place.
Also, of course, there is Britain at this point has a sort of a trading system of agreements within the empire called the Imperial Preference Trading System. And the Americans, in particular, Secretary of State Cordell Hull, want to dismantle this. They're keen on free trade, or at least freer trade. So they want to, as kind of so-called consideration for Lend-Lease help, they want to get Britain to make commitments to dismantle imperial preference. Actually, Churchill himself is relatively keen on free trade. That was why he left the Conservative Party for the Liberals in 1904, after all. But domestically, that is a problem for him because within the Conservative Party, there are many people who, like Secretary of State for India, Leo Amory, who take a very different point of view.
A final thing that I find is interesting that comes out of this first meeting that quickly goes away is in John Meacham's book, which I think is Partners in Power, about FDR and Churchill. And he raises the fact that after this meeting of the Atlantic Charter, each man came away thinking that the other one had an alcohol problem. FDR was concerned because Churchill was drinking whiskey all the time. He didn't know that Churchill's whiskey was watered down. And then conversely, Churchill was worried that FDR drank these incredibly strong martinis, so he assumed he was drinking them all day the way he was drinking the whiskey. And so there was a sort of brief moment when they're like, oh my God, that other guy's a drunk. I just think that's kind of funny.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, this sort of first meeting has gone very well from the kind of publicity point of view. There's newsreel footage that's carefully edited to, make a good impression in both Britain and America. Jock Colville, who was Churchill's private secretary, saw the raw footage and said that it was unbearably funny, but then was amazed when it was transformed into a very sort of click newsreel presentation. And so, probably by the sort of the end of the meeting, Roosevelt had gone about as far as he could go in respect of American public opinion. There was still great suspicion in America towards the British, the sense that they were trying to entice the Americans into the war. Lord Halifax, Churchill's former foreign secretary, he was now ambassador to the USA, was pelted with eggs by mothers in Detroit as late as November 1941. And then suddenly there is, on 7th of December 1941, a critical moment.
That's right. So students of history will know that the 7th of December 1941 was the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Empire of Japan. And this is a much wider thing that draws America into the war onto the Allies' side. And it's an interesting moment, I think, for lots of reasons. And one of the things I want to talk about is there's among historiography, there are certain circles that had accused Churchill of having known about this attack. Lots of other, and I agree with the other, that Churchill didn't know. In fact, intelligence decrypts indicated that there would be an attack, but everyone sort of assumed that it would be somewhere else. No one assumed it would be on Pearl Harbor. But this is a moment for Churchill where that's a watershed moment.
Absolutely. And Congress. But Churchill was having dinner or just sort of finished dinner when his butler comes in and tells him that there's been this dramatic event. They listen to the radio, and Churchill knows that Britain really is kind of saved, and he realizes that the United States is now in the war up to the neck and into the death, as he puts it. And he recalls in his memoirs that he went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful.
Which is a remarkable change of tone. And for the first time, I think, Churchill sees a way that a formal military alliance would be born.
So, the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President has entered a new, hugely significant phase.
The United States has joined the war. Churchill and FDR are allies.
But how will this new partnership develop in the face of defeats in the Pacific and German domination in Europe?
Join us to explore some answers next time here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.